on the rest of those questions, and we're also going to be producing a document that addresses them. So please keep your questions coming in. And I also just want to say that the three of us, Jason, Juliana, and myself, are members of the Black Members Standing Committee. Okay, so I've been told to kick it off, so here goes, and then I'll pass you over to the others. So what I want to do is just give you a few points on what I think that decolonizing institutions could mean, and also a few points on how we've been going about it in Kiel. So what does it mean when we talk about decolonizing institutions in education? I may be wrong, but I think that most people are right by now comfortable with the idea that a lot of what we've learnt in schools and colleges and universities has been based on what we call colonial knowledge, or knowledge that took for granted the superiority of the West, which was itself derived from imperial dominance. Equally, I think that just a little reflection on each of the disciplines that we learn and teach and research would illustrate their roots to be intrinsically connected to imperial progress, from anthropology to zoology, and also show how they're influenced by power dynamics in our contemporary world that dictate the importance of certain types of research and scholarship over others. We also know that the unfamiliarity, the strangeness of our predominantly white higher education institutions has very real effects on the life chances and educational attainment of people who are not white. Educational institutions, especially universities, are predominantly white spaces, spaces that don't reflect the multicultural nature of British society. Black people who do go on to higher education are least likely to get promoted or rise to the top of their profession. We know that. The reasons for this don't lie in some spurious notion of merit or deficit. It's because our Black students don't see themselves, their stories, their histories, their culture as given any importance in the curriculum that they study. The examples, influential thinkers, prize winners, and toppers of their disciplines are all from the global north and usually male. This profound imbalance is what the agenda to decolonize institutions tries to address. And it's up to us as workers in the field of education to try and think out how to go about it. As a number of people have been saying lately, and as the gist of so many of the questions that you posed when we announced this webinar suggest, it's not the why of decolonization that's at issue, it's the how. So how do we decolonize our curriculum? Let's not be afraid of this process. As educators, this is something that we do quite well. We rethink, we review, we constantly change what we teach, what we learn, what we research. Decolonizing isn't about taking away or destroying knowledge, as the headlines of the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph would suggest. It's about broadening out our educational resources, from case studies to paradigms, to draw from insights, research, and knowledge from the global south as well, to check that our learning materials and learning spaces are inclusive, to simply be more aware of the inequalities of our disciplinary canon. Educators have done this before. The 1960s and 70s overturned a lot of the syllabi of the past. We can do it again. It is, after all, what higher education is about, not to regurgitate a static body of knowledge or churn out expertise in a time-honoured canon, but rather to critique convention, to question social norms, to create new knowledge, to change society and offer different perspectives on scholarship. At Kiel, we began thinking about decolonizing about 2 years ago. We had a great cohort of students who were really motivated by what was going on in Cape Town and Cambridge and London. And during the UCU strike that year, our equality officer in Kiel UCU, Bulent Gokay, built a teaching program with the students and a number of us colleagues to start pushing to decolonize what we were teaching. Learning from decolonizing groups across the globe, we created a Decolonising Kiel manifesto and organised a number of events, inviting everyone in the university. This created a space for colleagues and students and even some members of the senior management team to talk about what decolonising Kiel could possibly mean, whether its practice across the globe was relevant to Kiel and what we could learn from it. At one of these events, Lola Olufemi, the then women's officer at Cambridge University Student Union, told us about how she and her fellow peers had tried to decolonise the English curriculum at Cambridge. At another event, a colleague of mine talked about gender and decolonisation. Another spoke about how to decolonise the phenomenon of so-called world music. I gave a talk about the worrying take-up of decolonisation in India, where it was and is being used by a very right-wing and populist government to further an Islamophobic and high caste agenda. So we were really trying to tease out what it was and how we, as teachers and researchers, were looking at it. This coincided with Kiel working on a Race Equality Charter Award, from which everyone could see how race affects staff progression and student attainment in really stark terms. This all converged to make decolonising a central university concern. We're now in the process of reviewing all of our modules in all subjects, and conversations are beginning on how to help colleagues in sciences as well as humanities look again at how we can all make our curriculum more inclusive and decolonised. However, this also raises issues about the hidden curriculum or on the way that institutions are structured. Who makes the strategic decisions in each of these institutions? Where does the power really lie? It's no surprise, I think, that a lot of the drive behind decolonising Kiel came at the same time as the pensions dispute and industrial action along with it. Just as it's no surprise that during our COVID context, especially affecting Black lives, as well as the horrific murder in Minneapolis that sparked off the Black Lives Matter movement, decolonising the curriculum is back on the agenda. This has also raised other concerns, especially now that the agenda has been endorsed by the university as a whole. How can we prevent it from simply being a symbolic, tokenist, tick box, management-led exercise? That will not achieve anything or affect any change. The most important aspect that we continually emphasize at Kiel is the centrality of student engagement. They are the ones who pressed it as a demand at the beginning. We need them to keep us on our toes now. We know that the most long-lasting, enduring innovations are generated from the shop floor when students and teachers work together. That's the most important thing. With all the challenges facing the higher education sector in the coming academic year, especially in regard to delivering the new normal, I hate that term, of blended learning and teaching, decolonising the curriculum may seem less of a priority. It could easily slip down the agenda or even off. We must keep it there, I think. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary projects. In adversity, higher education has often altered the status quo, the settled way of doing things. It's been the agent of change, not conservatism. There's no reason why it can't be that again. Okay, I'm going to stop. I've actually come in within the 10 minutes, so that's pretty amazing for me because usually I'm told I talk too much. We're now going to go on to Juliana.
Okay. So I'll try not to go over what Shalini has said, and just to give an overview of what we understand decolonization of institutions and curriculum to mean, and whether we think the new is not a thing, and to look at why we need to decolonize and what our responsibilities are towards this. So the decolonization of institutions agenda is a process whereby powerful institutions such as the universities and colleges and so on attempt to, and I say attempt to because that's what a lot of them are trying to do, rid themselves of colonial and imperial vestiges that have been used to exploit, oppress and suppress others who were seen as powerless, be it because of their nation, their race, or their class, or their gender, or even their sexuality. So this process is by no means a new thing. However, with COVID and with the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Movement, it has gained a new momentum. And so we need to seize this opportunity and hopefully bring about some concrete changes in within the institutions and the system to ensure that those most in need and those who suffered structural inequality are reflected within these institutions at all levels. So, so whose responsibility is it? The responsibility is all of us. It's for all of us to decolonize our institution. It's not just because people tend to say, oh, the Black workers should always, do this and do the other. But it's not solely the responsibility of Black workers. It's the responsibility of workers in their institutions and so on. However, it does require commitment and a willingness on all of us to play our part in changing the narrative that's been established over centuries, by those with the power to set up these institutions. So as I said before, it's not a new thing. African scholars have been writing about decolonizing the institutions, decolonizing institutions such as religion, churches, politics, economics, the media, more than anything. People like Ivan van Sertima, Henry Clark, Walter Rodney, Chancellor Williams, people like Amata Addo of Ghana, Osman Sembène of Senegal, Angela Davis, Ngugi wa Thiong'o of Kenya, Frantz Fanon. All of these people, and in recent time, we've had Ngozi Chimamanda Adichie, but to name a few, who have been working and tirelessly pushing for this agenda to change. The other people that we often tend to forget in this whole process of the call for decolonization is Black parents, because in the 60s, when Black people came into this country, and earlier as well, a lot of young Black children went into the schools and their needs were not being reflected, were not met. And a lot of people were failing in the education system. Some of them were put into educationally subnormal classes, so on. And so there was a lot of underachievement. And so Black children were not coming out with the qualification that they require in order to attain and go on to university or get a better job. So a lot of Black parents, there was a movement of Black parents who were pushing for a better education because they recognize that the education system has miseducated their children. And so some of the parents as well, since some of them were teachers in the countries that they came from, said set up voluntary groups to teach their children the basic skills. So this is where we have things like the Saturday schools and set up and summer school measures and so on to ensure that the children are getting the skills that they require. And lastly, we have students, in terms of people who have been pushing for this change, Black students and other students as well, both in Britain and those who are coming from overseas, asking for the curriculum to be decolonized. We've heard Shalini mention the thing about Rose Must Fall, campaign by the student. The students and UCLA students have been asking, why is our curriculum white? Why are we not having a representation of Black lecturers in our institutions and so on? Why are we having book lists that's predominantly white writers? And so there's a lot of push for this change. So why do we need to decolonize our institutions? So we need to reflect the interests of all people and appreciate all cultures within our institutions and curriculum that we work and the lecturers work in and we teach in and our students are learning in. We need to recognize other cultures' contribution to the world's civilization and heritage. So other cultures matter as well in terms of our teaching, and cultures have a past. So we need to know a lot about the ancient Egyptians, the West African, East African, North African civilizations, Aztecs, the Incas, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa civilization. All of these empires had well-developed system before the onset of Europeans, and these need to be in the education system. So it's important that we know what went on before the Europeans came into the shores of these countries. We need to decolonize because the institution need to read themselves and the curriculum of all the historical misconceptions that we've had about Black people, about people of color, and so on. And one of the first rule of denying a people of their right to live freely is to deny them their narrative, their history, their language, or scientific development. And a lot of that has gone on in Africa. It's also about breaking down the stereotypes to get rid of the education institutions' ignorance and racism, which is institutionalized and has been ongoing on a day-to-day basis. It's important that educators themselves are versed in the field, are the ones who are actually delivering them. So it's no point having somebody who's Black who can teach Black history, and then you say to them, "Oh, go and teach something else." When they've actually made it clear that they can teach that particular area, go and teach European history, for example, which is something that they're not versed in. And the thing to remember is that Black history or any of these subjects is not just for Black students, it's for all students. If we're informed, we will hopefully act differently. What it does as well for the Black students to have a much more diverse curriculum is that it gives them a sense of self-esteem and improves on their mental health well-being as well. So again, it's the thing about confidence that we want to see imbued in our Black students as well. Now, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of the persons I mentioned in my beginning session, talks about the importance of education. He talks about the role of education and culture in our education systems, and he talks about, and he asks the question: what is the relationship between education and culture in transforming the economy, political, and the social? And for him, education is part of culture and vice versa. And so you cannot have a situation where you have an education system that transmits a particular idea and expect other people or everybody to fall in line or to gain from it. So for him, education should give people knowledge of the world in which they live in, how they have shaped the world, and how the world have also shaped them. So for him, he's talking about an education that gives us a worldview, that frees up our minds and so on. And that might sound like something too radical, but it isn't actually. So he talks about, what kind of education are we talking about? And then he says that things like, depending on who's holding the power, education can either be used to eliminate our reality, or it can be used to mask the reality that we're faced with. And he says in a situation where you have a structured society where one nation or race or class or gender dominates another, as is the case in Britain, there can never be a neutral education transmitting neutral culture. So this is a key thing, is that the education system that we have at the present time that has not undergone decolonization does not transmit a neutral culture. It transmits a culture that suppresses and preserves the existing order and keeps those classes, those nations, those races, those gender under control in the way that they present their stuff. And he gives this illustration of A and B, A being the person who's oppressing, the exploiter, the suppressor, and then you have the B who's the one who's being exploited and so on. And the question is that what kind of education would you want that person to have? So depending on your position, you would be the one to decide, who would have the kind of education that they will get. So what that exemplifies really is colonialism. The ruling class or nation imposes rule and control over groups, over the people that they subjugate us. And the aim is to really to control their productive forces, and then colonize their minds as well. And what this shows is that you cannot have this without political control and without cultural control, and that can be direct or indirect in the way that it's carried out. So we do need to decolonize our curriculum because it benefits everybody. It benefits everyone. It benefits the students. It benefits the institutions. It benefits. It is in our interest to decolonize what we're teaching. You know, so and it's important that we teach history that teaches us about the lives of other cultures, that what they have contributed to the world and their participation in the world activities and so on, and what they have, their inventions and their art, their cookery, their language needs to also be recognized in the curriculums. So I'll stop it up there, and then I'll pick up the questions later and add a bit more to it. Thank you.
Jason?
Hi, first and foremost, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's keeping well. I feel really privileged to be sharing this platform with Shalini and Juliana. Thank you to everyone for taking the time this afternoon to be here, and also for Chris for organising it and the fantastic work that Rebecca's doing in terms of interpreting. In the first instance, you know, Shalini and Juliana have made some fantastic comments, and what I don't want to do is go over those fantastic points. I think what's really important is to kind of really engage with this idea of what, you know, decolonizing means. And, you know, I always say I'm yet to meet two people that have the same conception of that idea. And kind of Shalini mentioned that earlier. Juliana spoke about the idea of it being a collective endeavor. You know, it's a collective engagement. It's a collaborative engagement that requires all of us to engage in this line of work, because there's a benefit for all of us living in a multicultural, diverse society. I think the diluting of histories is an interesting thing, and there is a historical amnesia that ensues when we talk about issues around decolonizing, you know, and Black history and other Indigenous histories within that. I think importantly, what I want us to kind of move towards is kind of thinking about, you know, solutions, how we come up with solutions for this. And I think one of the most important things is really framing this discourse around how we create, you know, more practical solutions around how we address this. I think for many years, the charge has been left at academics of color and student activists and community activists. And while all of that endeavor is much needed and it's been relied upon, in many respects, it's also been exploited. It's, you know, often that labor is unremunerated. It's not rewarded fiscally in the same ways. I think what's really important is to think about how we can kind of reconceptualize decolonization, but more importantly, besides the actual work on the front line of decolonizing, really thinking about what the work behind the scenes looks like. And I think a lot of that comes from how we change our cultures in terms of our institutional cultures, in terms of where we reside, and think about actually questioning the function of the academy, what is its fundamental purpose. You know, it's to harbor all these canons of knowledge, but actually, who are the gatekeepers to this knowledge? And more importantly, how do we challenge those spaces? So I kind of want to prefer 2 or 3 suggestions that I think might lend itself to some of these ideas. I think fundamentally, we need to kind of think about what inclusion looks like. And when you kind of think of decolonizing, a strand within that, or a strand within inclusion, is decolonizing. I think that inclusive aspect becomes really important. Now, if we think about the dominant Eurocentric canon, it does the complete opposite of that. It excludes people, it marginalizes people, it keeps individuals on the periphery of understanding their own histories and understanding how that makes up their socialization and their understanding of the world. So I think one of the most important things is really thinking about how we engage in this idea of an inclusive framework. What does that framework look like? And within different institutions, you'll harbor different ideas and different things. But fundamentally, it's about thinking about how do we adopt the word inclusion? And do we use it for kind of benign purposes? If we're talking about decolonizing, the word inclusion becomes really important, because what we need within that is actually, we need to center Black students, and black staff. And we need to kind of really kind of encapsulate those ethnic minority voices, really to kind of center this argument and to think about how we engage with this in a more inclusive kind of dialogue. I think importantly, this endeavor needs to be resourced properly from a human resource point of view and a fiscal resource point of view. So we need to kind of move away from the exploitation of BAME labour in relation to this issue and move towards more strategic aims over prolonged periods of time that will look to address this, which need to be appropriately funded and really engage with the idea that actually, as Juliana said, to everyone's benefit to engage in this dialogue, and money needs to be put behind this. So, for example, continuing professional development where staff may not feel so comfortable engaging with this, ensuring that the labour itself is remunerated. So if individuals, particularly BAME individuals, are going to be tasked with spearheading this agenda within institutions, that they are remunerated for their time and their labour, and this goes towards aspects of career progression. Because often BAME staff are not in a situation where this kind of labour is valued, and it actually isn't acknowledged by senior stakeholders within universities, and that is problematic because that is exploitative in itself. I think the contours of racism mean that the idea of decolonising and decoloniality is changing all the time. We're finding, keeping abreast of racism as a new omnipresent force that reinvigorates itself and camouflages itself in so many different ways means that we have to be agile and vigilant to what decolonising means in these current violent and divisive times. And to that end, I think it's really important that we kind of think about what allyship looks like in mobilising decolonisation. So, for example, the reconceptualisation of decolonisation and allyship really requires people to think about, okay, in the spaces that we reside in, what does allyship look like? How can we dismantle these kind of inequitable structures beyond reading lists, assessments, diversification? What else can we actually do? It's about challenging those spaces, those gatekeeping spaces where knowledge is confined to this dominant white Eurocentric canon. It's about challenging those spaces in all of its insidious, covert and overt forms as a structural and systemic kind of symbol of, coloniality as we see it. And I think that becomes a really, really important thing. So in thinking about how we do that, it is important, particularly for white allies, to think about how we, impact that space and ensure that that engagement is collegiate rather than, as I've often spoken about, a seasonal approach. It needs to be 4 seasons as opposed to 1, and that's a really important thing going forward. I think it's really important just to finish on a couple of points. I think the idea of collective endeavour is important more now than ever. We live in divisive times, and to be quite honest, BAME people are exhausted. There's an exhaustion, there's a lethargy that's set in with doing this work. Haven't done it for so long. Now it's time for all of us to carry this burden. And I also talk about, within that, it's important to acknowledge that women of colour, particularly black women, have really been burdened with this work. And there's an acknowledgement that as a man of colour, a black man, I need to do more. I need to think about how I engage in these spaces and how I do that. Before I kind of think about, pointing the finger at anyone else, the first person I'm looking at is myself. And I'm always thinking about ways in which I can engage in that labour and ensure that it's equal endeavour, as opposed to it being unweighted endeavour and heavily in the fact that women of colour have been doing this labour. I think most importantly, it's collective. We all have to engage in it. And I think it's important to kind of think about the promise of universities. Universities embody what is their function towards society. And in many respects, they are a microcosm of society. And in being a microcosm of society, we have to engage in histories that reflect that society over a prolonged period. And I mean a global society, not just one that's situated within the global north specifically. So I think that's really, really important. I just want to finish by saying that I think in these really difficult times and in the wake of Black Lives Matter and everything that's happened, I think it's important. And I'm guided by a saying that I heard recently, actually, in a documentary I watched about Hillary Rodham Clinton. And I know she's a divisive figure, but she said something that I actually thought was really, really powerful for these times. And she derived it from an old Methodist saying. And it says, we all need to do all the good we can to all the people, all the ways we can. I think that's the point. I couldn't think of a more important way framing this kind of collective endeavour, pulling it together. That's really important. Thank you so much for your time. It's not lost on me that it's the middle of the day and people have taken the time to engage with the three of you. But thank you so much, and really looking forward to engaging with all of you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Juliana. So what we're going to do now is, as I said before, we picked out 3 questions each from the 100 or so questions that we that we were faced with over the weekend. So I'm gonna. And what we're going to do is we're going to read out our questions and then respond to them. So I will kick off again. My first question is, which disciplines seem to be more colonized from amongst natural and social sciences? And my response is that, I mean, I guess we can explore all of our subjects using this decolonizing lens, and that some subjects have been better at doing it than others. So, for example, subjects like English and history. But there are a cluster of disciplines that emerged in the Age of Enlightenment, which is a period that was intrinsically connected with imperialism and slavery. So sciences that are based on a hierarchical system of classification of different phenomenon, sciences like biology, chemistry, geology, but also social sciences like economics and law, and others that came later, subjects like anthropology and sociology as well. And just looking at it from this decolonizing lens, it sort of explains why, for example, students in newly independent African nations were actually using European specimens in their geology lessons in the 1960s. Okay, so that was my very brief response to the first question. The second question I'm going to look at is how to get students involved and participate in this process. Hopefully I address some of this in my actual talk, but I would say we need to work with the student union. We need to work with students in different societies as well. We need to organize workshops collectively. And in workshops where they are equally involved, and we also need to go with their initiatives. That's certainly something that we thought was really important at Kiel. And in the classroom, we need to nourish their curiosity. If they bring up stuff that we don't know, it's actually okay to learn from our students. I was reading the other day about a music student who tried to talk about rap at her university, a very prestigious university, and she was faced with ignorance. And we don't know everything, but I think we need to be willing to learn from our students and rethink from them. My last question that I'm going to look at is a complex question. What are the major issues in the use of the concept decolonize in the HE sector? Unless we're clear about what we mean by it, can we use it successfully to disrupt and dismantle established hierarchies? I do actually agree with the premise of this question, and I think that Jason addressed it as well. Decolonizing can perhaps mean so much that it actually, potentially it could end up meaning nothing at all. And yeah, you could say that perhaps decolonizing is simply an academic exercise about the stuff that we teach and research and stick to that. But I do think that it's also connected with what I talked about, the hidden curriculum that I mentioned. And also, it might be that we make most difference, most decolonizing difference in the classroom effectively, but I think it's also good that we engage as anti-racist activists in our unions and our workplaces too. Okay, Juliana, your questions?
Yeah, okay. So my question is about decolonizing the curriculum in FE. If we can give a particular example. Well, the example I can give is Sheffield, but it was in the past. And one of the things we have to maybe do is to revisit some of the things that have been done in the past that has worked, and look to include those in what we're wanting to do now. And one of the things I'd like to do, first of all, is to give tribute to some of the young people who participated in the Black Lives Matters movement in Sheffield, because some of these young people were people who were teaching in Saturday schools, after school clubs, and summer measures. And some of them went through the Access program as well as doing A-levels as well. One of the things we did do in Sheffield is that they had set up a Black Access program, because it was recognized that Black people were not going through the system in terms of getting education, getting qualification, going into workplace, and having a place there and working and earning income and supporting their families and so on, and contributing to society. And so what the Black community did was to fight for the Black Access program after the riots took place and all the rest of it. Now, that program produced a curriculum that was different from what we teach, every other day in the schools, because the students needed to understand how we come to be where we were. What is it in the system that's created the condition that they find themselves in? And especially some of the Black men who found themselves always at odds with the legal system or with the police and all the rest of it. And they needed to understand, what is it about our history that's created a situation whereby we are hated so much, and there's a lot of racism against them, and that has resulted in that being institutionalized to the extent that they can't get qualification. So what we did was to devise a curriculum that had at its core Black history. And this is not a history that tells you, oh, how wonderful Africa was, or anything like that, or the Caribbean, or the Americas, or the India and Pakistanis, but to really look at the concrete contributions Black people have made over the years to the world history, and that they were not on the periphery. At the beginning, they were at the core of all the activities that's going on. So the whole idea is to start by looking at what was there before the Europeans came. What changed? Why did it change? The whole thing about historical change and so on. But at the same time, we were giving students the tools of analysis to analyze society. So they were looking at things like, in terms of race, nation, class, gender analysis, and so on, and looking at how that impacted on their being. But also they were developing skills of evaluation, interpretation, and all the rest of it, all the academic skills that they will need for higher education. So that gave students a lot of confidence. So first of all, they knew who they come to. It's the thing about their identity. They come to know who they are and why they are in the situation that they're in, and what they need to do in order to move forward. And so these are the kind of thing with it, and how to challenge racism within institutions, and how to deal with microaggression when it comes to them, and so on. So those are kind of thing that we did. The other thing with the community did in Sheffield was to run after school clubs and so on, where some of these issues were replicated, and Black children gained from that. So that, but the cuts actually has impacted on these provisions, and so because of the cuts, a lot of these provisions had gone to the wall. Okay, so what was the second question again? The second question was about exam boards, I think. Yeah, but it's something about the exam boards. I had a discussion with my daughter about this when I was thinking about this, and she was saying things like, well, the exam boards, need to be a bit more diversified. The members need to be diversified. The curriculum itself needs to be looked at. Again, it's back to the whole thing about the curriculum, because the curriculum drives what's taught. In the books, for example, I noticed that recently, and even in the books that I use for teach sociology and so on, some of the examples, some of the imageries that are portrayed there are so negative. So, for example, you have a picture of a black student, a white student. The white students is projected at the forefront, and black students are at the back, of that whole thing. So that sends a subliminal message that they're not important. They must also use research as an example done by black lecturers or black researchers or black writers or intellectuals, not just the white sounding white names and so on. They must also depict black people in a positive way, so, and they must have within their decision makers a lot some diversity in terms of black markers, black exam board setting questions and all the rest of it. So we need to have that. And I just wanted to mention that one of the things that students found out was that in terms of games development courses, there's often this notion that, it was white people who developed it. But the reality is that there's a lot of black game developers, and when students do their research, they find that there are, and lecturers also need to learn from that.
Are you looking at the last question, Julia? What can be done?
Okay, yeah, and look at the last question. The last question is about visual awareness. This is great. We need to see more examples of black people in positions in positions of power, in positions in pictures, in around the colleges and institutions and so on. We need to see more drawings of them, illustrations of people like, or pictures of people like Mary Seacole, people like William Kofi, Claudia Jones, all the people who are involved in movements and so on, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, all of these people need to be given prominence. But also we need to see pictures of the students who have achieved in the colleges, in the universities. I went to one college in Birmingham, and they had these pictures of students who have achieved and how much they had achieved and where they went to university and the kind of subject that they studied. So that's quite important. But also, aside from that, we also need to know in concrete terms the number of our students who are going into universities and so on to do medicine, to do law, to do dentistry and so on, and not just have them as pictures. We need to have more black staff and not just token appointments in positions and so on. And I just wanted to add to that one of the things that Jason mentioned is the thing about we need to be more reflective. And I think for us to be able to teach or do a lot of this stuff, we really need to need to be looking at the way we look at things ourselves as educators. We need to decolonize our own minds and so on. Okay, so and we need to be prepared to learn about other cultures as well.
Jason?
So thank you, Shalini.
Thanks. Jason?
Hi, thanks again. Just to follow on from the points made by Shalini and Juliana, I think one of the most important things is really thinking about this idea of resistance. And very often, in terms of the white fragility aspect, there's often kind of this wall of resistance that one encounters, which can be really difficult in terms of managing this discourse. And it's almost, a violence that people of color experience. They face the kind of the visceral experience of racism, and then it's that kind of violence having to manage the emotions of white people within this dialogue. And Robin DiAngelo talks a lot about this in terms of in terms of white fragility. And I think one of the things in terms of the question in terms of how we tackle resistance amongst colleagues, I think that this is a really important thing. I think one of the things that I wouldn't like to say that I've conceded this, but I accept, is that some people are not for turning. Some people's heads are not for turning. And I sometimes think it's better that we kind of engage with those who actually want to make change. I actually think that there's a bigger critical mass of people that want to create change and cultivate a new conceptualization of what belonging, inclusion, decolonizing could mean. And I think that is where our energies should lie. I think in relation to the question, how do we tackle resistance among colleagues who think this is unnecessary? I think if they have that mindset in the first place, and attempts have been made to try and change their way of thinking, I think that is wasted energy. I wouldn't focus my energy on those individuals. And I say that because I do optimistically, maybe naively believe that there's a big critical mass of people that want to make a change. And I'd rather we focus our collective energies on galvanizing that collective consensus and effort rather than focusing on people that will, who want to think in this way. And that for me is a choice. There's not a, what they found their beliefs on in the first instance is based on a supremacy that positions Black people of color as deficit. So if that is something they want to engage with, then I personally wouldn't waste my energy, because I do believe, as I said, potentially, maybe naively, that there's a greater mass of people that want to embody change and to see it reflected in all of its intersectional forms, in this specific case, race. I can go on to the next question. So the next question. That's okay. So the next question is on BAME lecturers. BAME lecturers may be victimized and further discriminated if they speak out against. So I just noticed in one of the comments that a colleague of ours just spoke about, in many cases, actually, BAME colleagues who engage in this endeavor are seen as troublemakers. And I think it's a difficult thing. I think that placing of the head above the parapet becomes really, really dangerous for BAME colleagues who already reside in a very toxic environment. And we kind of think of the soil of higher education. The soil itself is toxic, and because of that, it doesn't allow BAME and professional staff to grow in the way that they should. I think this is where allyship becomes a really, really important tenet. And I think thinking about how white allies can engage in this space is important, because all too often, as I mentioned before, the labor of this work, particularly, it's laid at the feet of women of color. And that further discrimination, what does it look like in real terms? It looks like a lack of promotion. It looks like complete alienation from department teams. It looks like a lack of agency. It looks like a lack of, it ends up becoming salary differential. So I do think it's really important that, what white allyship looks like going forward must look to disrupt these spaces. It can't be left to just BAME individuals to disrupt these spaces when in many cases they don't have the power or the privilege to advance that agenda, not because they themselves don't have a power and a personal privilege, but because those spaces don't acknowledge or accept that power and that privilege. And we know that the centrality of whiteness is what occupies that particular structure of racism as we see it. So I do think that it's important that we think about how white allyship can be reconceptualized to really take the labor of this work off BAME individual staff. And sorry, in relation to the last part, in terms of what do you do to protect yourself from this, I don't think there is anything that can protect one from this, to be honest. I think what can be kind of configured is really thinking about how that labor or that burden can be lifted. And I think because the idea of protecting oneself, I think, is a very difficult thing just because of how insidious racism is.
And the last question, senior leaders.
And in terms of senior leaders, I think the biggest thing that we've kind of all collectively mentioned is this idea of money. I think that it's really, really important to think about how we engage with human resource and fiscal resource. And I think, and I don't want to label this at all senior leaders, but I think there's a lot of senior leaders who've been absent. They've been absent from this discussion for many, many years. And where we've seen really pertinent advancements in gender equality, in FE and in higher education, we don't actually see that in we haven't seen that with regards to race. And I think one of the things that's kind of really central to these arguments is that often race work or race interventions such as the REC are not funded. And we kind of need to think about, okay, if it isn't funded in the same way that Athena Swan was, then how do we actually think about funding these things internally? And I think the internal funding of this and resourcing of this is really, really important. And more important than that, it needs to be institutional wide. So too often you get localized pockets of fantastic practice within institutions. But what we need is a really collected consensus around how we engage with this. and universities need to commit, senior leaders need to commit to this financially, because if they don't, the consequence is really that we're going to continue to have a racist academy, and invariably, the individuals who benefit from this, who are most significantly disadvantaged from this inequitable academy, are BAME staff. And I think we do need to think about how we engage in better outcomes for them, better progression. Ideally, I think to kind of change the discourse and the lexicon of this language, we also need to see a diversification of BAME leaders. And I think that would also change some of the conversations that we have around race and racism and how we occupy certain spaces. But I do think that this is really, really important. And for me, I think that, again, there is a collective consensus among senior leaders that now is a time to act, and now is a time to, invest significantly and over a strategic period of time in these endeavours in both the FE and higher education sectors.
Thank you. Okay, so now a couple of minutes on summing up. Juliana?
Well, what I would like to see is institutions telling and showing us what they're doing to decolonize their institutions. Not just us telling them what they should be doing, but what are they doing? What are they doing about their curriculum? What are they doing about staffing? What are they doing about promotion of Black staff? And how are they doing it? And how much resources are they putting into this program? Just to follow on from what Jason has said. How much link do they have with the Black communities in this country? And other than just going overseas and recruiting overseas students and making money out of them, what are their goals for the Black communities? About their resources, how are they bringing it up to date to meet the needs of the Black community and all students for that matter? So we really need to look at, what programs that they're carrying forward and how they're approaching these things.
Thank you. Jason, summing up?
Yeah, just to sum up, I think one of the most important things is that in terms of thinking about, what we need to do moving forward, again, just to reiterate, I think a collective consensus is really important. I think there has to be an acknowledgement that over a prolonged period of time, and if we just look at this from a historical perspective, the work of decolonisation has really unfairly laid at the feet of women of colour. And I do think that is something that I know I keep going on about, and I've gone on about it in several platforms, but I do think it's a really important thing, because I think how we think about the labour of that work is very, very important going forward, because I think that, yes, BAME individuals collectively are exhausted from this, but actually we need to think about how we all engage in this work to remove that work from BAME women, because, if we look at EDI departments, if we look at most of the engagement that happens in this across institutions across the UK, it is often women that engage in this endeavour, women of colour. And I do think we all need to think about the burden of those women of colour over such a long period, and how we all look to engage in that collectively to alleviate that burden and make it a collective endeavour rather than an individually focused one.
Great, thank you. I've learned so much from both of you today. It's been really great. What I would sort of emphasize from what I was saying is two things. One is to really take the to keep students central. I think that's very important, because if they're not part of this, it doesn't it's not going to happen. So that's really, really important. And also, don't just leave it to it's not just about certain subjects. It's about the institutions as a whole. That's the whole point of what we've been talking about today. So I think that's really important too. Okay, so thank you everyone for clicking onto this. I was going to say tuning in, but it's not tuning in, is it now? We've hopefully it's been helpful to you. We in the Black Members Standing Committee have been helping to produce a number of different types of resources on this work, on decolonizing, on what it could mean, and most of that is on the website, on the UCU website, and also there's a you can see on the screen there's a link to it now. So basically, thank you all for clicking on. Thank you to the other contributors, my colleagues in the Black Members Standing Committee. Thank you, Rebecca, and also thank you to Chris Nicholas, who made this possible. We wouldn't have been doing this if it wasn't for him. Also, please keep on, if you are interested in this, please keep on sending in your questions. Let us know if you want more sessions like this, and yeah, stay safe, be well.
Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
And maybe Jason now will sing
done.
to us, because we have finished early, but I'm not saying
Oh, listen, hey, look, I'm going to stand up right now. I'll do it. So true, funny how it seems, always in time and never in line for dreams. Head over heels when toe to toe.
Stop. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.